Thanks for coming. Tonight we have Carlo McCormick, critic, writer, East Village expert of long standing, and James Romberger and Marguerite Van Cook, who had a very early and very special space in the East Village that was dear to our hearts in the very early days, and certainly to David Wojnarowicz's heart, I know. And they're going to talk together, and we'll have questions after.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thanks, Hal. Thanks, everyone, for coming. And nice to see you guys. We live, I think, about 2,000 feet from each other.
Pretty much.
Yeah. And I never see you, so it's nice to...
We never leave that.
I know. We've, of course, been having a conversation somehow over many decades now. And we've probably asked each other equal number of questions, but this time I get to ask the questions. So I guess maybe the simplest, most generic way to start would be to talk about kind of how and when you met. Did you meet David first or Luis first, or like how deep can we recover these memories? I can't remember which one I met first, but I was wondering if you guys know or.
Well, actually, Marguerite had this big space on Avenue A, which was, I think there's like a 7-Eleven there now. And she had a rehearsal studio in there, and she would paint in the front. And she had people like Wayne Kramer from the MC5 would come in there and play, and a bunch of Jamaican guys like from different bands. And Shannon Dawson was one of the same-os. He came
Conk,
in.
yeah.
He had Conk in there. And I met Marguerite around that time, and she said she saw some of my drawings at my little apartment I shared with Seth from World War III. And she goes, "Oh, you should show your stuff to this little gallery around the corner that has this fantastic work by this person that had a sex change," and that was Greer Langton. And so I went on, I had this like roll of pastel drawings that they weren't even like covered with vellum, they were just like rolled up. And brought them around, and I looked at the show, I was like, oh my God, this stuff is so intense, like so emotional, and so well drawn, and with her little sewn together dolls and things, and that's where I saw David there, and he actually looked at my stuff, because Dean wasn't there, and he was like, oh my God, and he was like, he told Dean to give me a show. And for some reason or another, I don't believe why, I didn't kind of move on it. I was really not thinking in terms of wall. I mean, I had those drawings, but I really wasn't, I didn't motivate on it. I was busy doing kind of graphic things and having fun in the East Village or whatever, gallivanting around. And then, I don't know, it wasn't that long after that. It was maybe a year after that. We actually ended up, because Dean, we put Dean in we started doing shows at nightclubs, at Danceteria and stuff, and we do like these huge things. It was like 100 artists. We did like the East Village Look Again or something, and we did that acid show, which you had a certain thing to do with.
I think I might have catered that.
And we actually asked Dean to be in the show, and he was so happy because nobody had ever asked him to be in the show, or nobody even cared that he was a painter. So we put him in the show, and he came to the thing, and he was just beaming and gleaming, and he goes, he knew that we were actually looking for an apartment, and he said, you guys are looking for a place, we just got a new space over on like Avenue B or something, here's the keys to our old space, you guys can just move in there. And so we moved in the back, and then we just opened the front.
Can you give me a date, Brian?
Like 1984, mid-1984, or towards the summer of 84, I think.
Yeah, we were coming back from Kamikaze. We just about 2 o'clock in the morning. We ran into Dean and just gave us the keys.
He just gave us the keys.
We didn't go out. We just went there.
Well, so yeah, and then we put up a show. The first show that we did, I don't know how the hell I met Robert Costa, was this curator, and he put me in a show called Racist America, and then he bought my piece out of that. And then we had him curate a show at our gallery, and he wrote such a fantastic press release that was like, imagine East Village is burnt burnt down with crispy paintings laying around or something, and here's the show start again, building up from the ashes. And he did this fantastic press release, and Grace Gluck from New York Times came down on her bicycle and wrote this review and put it on the front of the Arts and Leisure section on Sunday, and put Calvin Reed's beautiful drawing on there. And I think Hal came in that weekend.
Maybe.
Maybe. Yeah.
Well, when Dean's brother reached out to me about, 10 years ago or something, goes like, I got all this stuff from my brother, like, could you tell me what, like, the art is? And obviously anything that had been worth anything was sold by Dean, on his long spiral downhill, but that's how I got to see Dean's paintings.
He was so sweet
Yeah,
to us.
yeah.
He was always nice.
Well, I think it was, and Hal would have to help me on the date. I'm pretty sure it's 82 is when I met them. And the first two things I wrote or ever published, and they were in the Eye. The first one was on the pier, which was this abandoned pier on Spring Street, obviously the west side, and which David and Mike Bidlow and Luis Frangella had started, and all these other artists had gone there. And the second thing was a review of Luis's show at Hal Bromm. So those are the first two things I wrote. The first one I just signed Carlo. The second one I went as far as to sign Carlo M. And then my mom gave me shit for not using my last name, so
It's like Walter Winfield and Carlo.
Well, that was the thing. It was such a post-punk era. I was like, Richard Hell and Lydia Lunch had already taken their names. I couldn't come up with anything, so I thought I'd come up with something, and then I
How
got...
dare you not use your punk name?
That's when we met when he wrote the Pier thing. 'Cause I started working at the Eye just then.
Really? Okay, I couldn't remember that.
So just one of the first people I met in New York, when I was in London playing rock, so I was in a rock and roll band. I had been touring with the Clash, and somebody from the East Village Eye was in London, right on their first editions, and came up and started talking to me at the gig. And so when I got to New York, within a very short period of time, it was like issue number 2 or something, I went over to Leonard and said, I met this friend of yours in New York, and he was like, who? But anyway, but then I wrote for the East Village Eye right away.
Early on.
Very early on, in the very first issues. And Leonard has been a very good friend of ours ever since. And at the time, Mick Jones from The Clash had given us one of his ruffle shirts, right, to bring back, we had it. And Leonard came over to dinner, and he insisted on putting the shirt on that Mick Jones had worn.
He had an afro, too.
He had a sort of afro. And so we took pictures of him in that shirt, and it's been my blackmail material for Leonard ever since.
Puffy shirt.
He wanted to wear the puffy shirt, right?
Well, the other thing I remember about 82, because I don't remember much, but the Falklands War happened, and I remember Luis had a kind of little reception at his studio down in Tribeca here. Or no, it was the one. I'm sorry, it was on the Lower East Side. He had a studio. He had a studio down here. It all kind of drifts in and out of consciousness. But Tessa, my wife's also English, and she had some really nasty drunken friends over from England, and Luis had, was kind of honoring that the Argentine ambassador to the United States was here at that time, and it was kind of like, and these people got so drunk and so rude, like, yeah, fucking Argies, like this, like really like, we're kicking your ass on that sheep island. And it just struck me because I don't think I knew Luis that well, and I was pretty easily mortified back then. And Luis was just such a consummate gentleman, and it is kind of funny to think of those two having, those periods when they were really tight friends, because Luis was kind of various, the Argentines tend to be more European than Europeans, and so sophisticated and polite and stuff like that. And David, not only just because of his moods, but he also kind of had the Genet mind of a criminal and stuff like that. So I do think it's an odd pairing. I don't know how that struck you that way.
No, I think you're right.
What did you say about his first opening that you went to on your own? That you
Yeah.
went to McCormick?
You can tell her stories for her. She doesn't remember.
Yeah, I know I remember, I just didn't want to bring it up.
Go ahead.
No, I went to David's first show at Civilian Warfare, and I was there, and Willoughby was there, Willoughby Sharp.
Willoughby Sharp, yeah.
And some other reprobates, and they were playing craps in the corner of the gallery. And now that I look back at that, it probably wasn't very nice of us to be
It was the
involved.
heads, right? Was that the heads?
No, it had the hanging globes, and to be honest, I thought some of the installation was a bit primitive.
You said doofy was the word.
Well, that wasn't,
So that
that-
was my first take on some of
Yes.
the construction of it, because I was coming from an English art school.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been in these rock bands, but prior to that, I'd been in English art school, and everything was very black and white, and it was very conceptual and tidy, and so coming to the East Village was an extension of my punk experience in England. But it was even more freeform, in the sense that English punk was so structured. It sounds ridiculous to say, but people had their uniforms. It was very much, you had to, in order to be a real punk at that time, you had to adopt that lifestyle 24/7. If you were not totally authentic in everything you did and thought, you were on the outs. I came to New York, and people were not pure in the sense that they weren't purely punk. They were a little bit rockabilly, and they had all these different looks thrown in. They had a little bit of long hair maybe still, and there were, so it was bell bottom. It was like this whole vestiges of other lives. And so David's thing, it seemed to me very mixed, in the same way that it was borrowing from different parts of the world. It was borrowing conceptually, but it was also this expressionist.
I think there was a lot of hybridity also in the music and in everything.
Yeah.
I mean, I mean, if I have to think back to the beginning, David's autodidact, self-taught artist, and the early works did not super refined, and then Luis conversely was a real virtuoso painter, and I couldn't prove it or anything, but I do think that David and a lot of people learned a lot about painting from Luis.
Absolutely.
And one of the things I remember being in Luis's studio with David, and it was like all these big heads, Hal, you'll know this work, like kind of at weird angles. And then Dave was like, no, look at this. And it was like these beautiful little clay heads Luis had made. And he put them down, and then he would make the painting, kind of gridding it out, whatever, based off these little beautiful heads.
Or he used those to paint from.
Yeah, he used them to paint from. And there's something about, I think, that the way, not only, for his skills or whatever, but Luis had a mastery of scale that that's the part I think David learned from.
Was he
because David was all,
trained, or?
yeah, right. He's like totally, yeah. And had a successful career as an artist already in Argentina before he moved here. So I do think that when you see David working in the pier, and you see, you kind of see the work blowing up in scale like that, versus the much more, we were all living in East Village tenements, so no one had a lot of room anyway. It wasn't like we were going to make Soho style loft work. But there's something I think Luis brought to that.
Well, David wouldn't sculpt the clay, he'd make paper mache. He'd
Yeah.
That's strange.
I mean, it's undeniably, if you spent any time around Luis watching him paint, and I just, it's like a fetish to me to think about these beautiful long brushes that he had. He had these amazing long brushes, and just, they of themselves were something that you wanted to, to get up and hold his brushes. They're fantastic. And he was just so elegant, really moving, and there was no pause in the way he painted these big strokes. And it was lovely to watch it. Sometimes I wasn't 100% sure about the mark, but the gesture was phenomenal. And eventually it came together in this really great movement. And I think, for all of us, because we went on that road trip together, and
yes.
Part of what happened after that was we did more of these group installations, And Luis came and painted in our backyard on one occasion. The last gallery we had, he did an installation which very few people have seen. And he painted swarms of rats, yellow rats, climbing all over the walls. It's stunningly beautiful. It's just, again, it's this sweep, the breadth of his mark. And just, so even though he's using these smaller animals, these yellow rats, they're just flowing. It's like water
so
flowing.
wet that he could actually make it flow over bricks.
So we all learned from that.
Amazing. I wish I'd seen that.
Yeah.
Was that the 10th Street
You were,
place you had?
you were listed as responsible.
Oh, maybe.
You always got your credit.
We can't remember.
That was that
But-
was on 9th Street. That was in the back of 9th Street, which was our last space.
Okay.
But one other thing that Luis did for me, which I was just saying it to James yesterday, that was a sort of, two people have said things to me that have changed my approach. Because we had a gallery, and part of what you think a gallery might be is to sell artwork. And at a certain point, I had two impulses. One, I wanted to do installations. And it was very hard for anybody to understand what was required. When I would say, come and do an installation. And it wasn't sort of on their radar yet. And so people were still trying to do things on the walls, or just color the room, or have us move things on the walls, and they didn't grasp the whole idea of installation. So I've just moved away from the point I was going to make about Luis, but I'll come back.
Go ahead.
I'll circle back. So what David did, which was really interesting, was he was one of the first people to grasp the idea of installation. And he built a wall in the middle of the gallery with a peephole, and I always thought how interesting that was in respect to other works that he did, which have this voyeuristic quality, that he has people looking through things. In the comic we did, there's a passage where he's a young child and he's being forced by this John to look through a crack in the wall at a prostitute having sex. But I see that in his work a lot of times, this outsider positioning. And I hadn't really thought about how much he wanted to position our viewers as outsiders. So he created an outside space that they could look through. And I think, that was part of his reading material that he had been really interested in. I haven't heard many people say this, but I think Camus was in there, the outsider, and David adopting that position in the installation. Now, the thing I was going to say about Luis was I was having difficulty selling the work, in the sense that I had so many scruples. And David had made all these pieces on rotting paper, and a lot of our artists had things that were going to disintegrate. And I was worried about it, I was like extremely worried about selling these things that were just going to fall apart. And I said, oh my God, what am I going to do? And these people I don't know, they're like, they just seem to want to buy things to sell it again. And it's, And Louis said to me, he said, there is no such thing as bad money. Money is not bad. What you do with money can be great. And I looked at him and I said, oh, thank you. I've never forgotten that. So I never had the same guilt taking money and spending it.
And that was the day you stopped being punk.
And that was the day. He said, oh, they just want it, And so Rodney said something very similar to me. It's just, when you'll see them, they just lust for it, they want it. And I was like, oh, that's nasty, but okay.
Yeah.
So it was okay to sell these things,
So, and then we do have you mentioned that we all took a trip together, right?
Yes.
We have this history because you did an LSD show, but in 1984, this alternative space in Virginia, I think it was in Richmond, asked me to curate an East Village show. And I think we'd already done our East Village RIP. If we hadn't, it was certainly on our minds. And the idea of doing an East Village show sounded just really dreadful and wrong to me. But I said, well, how about we do an installation? I bring the artist down instead of the work down, because you're a broke-ass alternative space anyway. So we pile into a few cars, and I actually can remember this now because Tessa, my wife, who's a really interesting filmmaker, now all these years later, what is that, 30-something years later, had actually just edited some of the footage down and made like a 7-minute movie, which just premiered in Korea for Gracie Mansion's show.
Really? No shit.
So at this place called Neapolitan Gallery, I believe it was. It was the two of you who kind of were having a bad trip and fighting and kind of writing little mean notes to each other on the wall.
We had the baby with us.
And you had, that's right, and Crosby was
In a rug in the middle of the floor. And everybody was taking turns and going over and sitting with him.
and David and Luis and David West and Christoph Kohlhofer.
No, Marilyn Minter.
Oh, just
No,
Marilyn
Christoph,
Minter.
Just Marilyn.
Just Marilyn.
Who insisted on projecting from her image up
Right.
in the dark.
Yeah.
And
And
we're like trying to paint.
she claims to me that was the last time she did drugs, but I don't really remember her doing drugs that trip. But who knows?
Well, all they did was there was nothing. You got to the place, they didn't have food or anything. There was nothing. They just left cases of beer.
Yeah, they were scared by us. And then I remember one of the kids' parents like came in, and this artist David West, who was really great, really crazy artist, lives in Paris now. He had and he was really tripping his brains out. And he had started along the baseboard. And we totally fucked up the place. We didn't even throw down drop sheets or anything. We just the place was just destroyed.
Beautiful wood floor.
Beautiful wood. I mean, we were really the worst guests you could ever be, but they were pretty horrible hosts. But he was writing, he had started along one baseboard fuck the mother, kill the father. And then, and kind of been writing it, but it was getting more and more frenzied. And by the end, when they're walking in, it's fada mata kida fada, it's this totally, and the parents were just totally freaked out. That's kind of when I felt good about the show.
I don't even remember them coming. They were doing flying needle noses everywhere.
That was really great. It was really fun because
bumblebee with pointy noses everywhere.
It was really collaborative. But anyway, it'll be nice to see Tessa's film. I'll have to have her show.
That got reviewed in Flash Art, and they put this review and they said, "Oh, here was this horrible, shitty mess that these idiots made." And then it says there was one poignant section in the corner, a little argument of who's going to hold the baby and who's going to paint by David West and his wife Andrea Garcia.
Oh, I love it. Yeah.
It's what? That was our review, though. Oh,
that was your brief marriage
that's
to David West.
That's the only review we ever got.
Yeah. Let's see.
But what was great about that, and so David. So Luis is a really good guiding figure, right? And Luis always. We keep going back to the scale and open spaces. But Luis is the one that would open up the space, and he was there with these big brushes, and he, put a broom and even put another brush on the end of that, and so he's the one that started moving us out of our own little spaces. And I remember James and I, we were scared that we wouldn't get a place to paint because people were going really fast and grabbing up these spaces. So we sort of got this. I said, let's make it look like newsprint. Well, so we just painted everything mushy color, and you came over and said, only you guys could come out of the East Village and make a space look dirty.
Filthy little corner.
Yeah, that's it.
But Luis broke it up, and
no idea what the hell I was doing.
What was so nice about that particular group of people was that nobody went over anybody else's work, and everybody went right into each other's work.
Right.
So there was no tension or.
It's like us, we were over in the corner.
Yeah, you had your own.
We did start moving around, but it was really a friendly crowd,
Unfortunately, David had all that Utrecht paint, which is
right.
All that cheap paint.
Well, David brought the paint. He had a lot of Utrecht paint, and he used to buy these big pots, and so that was.
If it wasn't for him and that freaking Rambler or whatever that he drove, and he wouldn't be able to do anything.
So that was a lot of the palette was dictated.
Was that a Rambler?
Yeah.
It had the wood slats on the side.
Yeah.
But so a lot of the palette from that period is dictated by David's buying those Utrecht paints, and they would come in these big pots and even bigger ones, and so then everybody used them, and that was how that. It was his palette. We all wound up living in his
that looks like
in his world.
Blue, doesn't it?
It's got white in it.
So, thinking of the piece you guys did, because it was like this weird little pictographic conversation going on with a lot of text. I do think a little bit about comics and narrative, because one doesn't automatically associate the East Village with a comic scene, except for like World War III, and really like kind of you're one of the guys doing it, but everyone in the East Village or of that generation grew up on comics, and it kind of like it was throughout all the work, and I just wondered how you did a great comic book in collaboration with David, 7 Miles a Second. But how does for him and for other people you might think of, how does the comic kind of form of narration work into this like moment of like shamelessly narrative, figurative, representational art?
Well, it was a conversation, and essentially, it's conversational. So one of the nice things, other people were doing it, the same type of thing, and I am going to put myself on the same page as Basquiat. But we were writing things and crossing them out. And a lot of times people would come in and say, God, I wish you would let us read everything, But it was part of having these conversations and disclosing or allowing certain amounts to be seen and revealing. Because we're in a closed environment. If we were below 14th Street and if we were part of that world, we were to ourselves. We were all in love with each other. We all loved each other. We were like, oh my God, it was like so fantastic. So we had spurring each other on, some rivalry, some, just following in somebody's footsteps. But so making these images with text were very much part of what was happening on the street. We had writers on the street. We had graffiti artists who were writing. We had other artists around us who were putting text on the street. So it was a logical thing to move into.
Yeah, I mean, David had a particular affection for comics, though. I mean, I think. I mean, if I remember, like, he used to do these, really early on, he did these Archie comics. Did you guys ever see those?
Yeah, he did some for Thomas Red Drum.
But I mean, I'm just thinking,
made them Mr. Weatherby.
I was just thinking of the craft jelly.
Yeah,
like Archie and Jughead. It was like Betty Veronica became the man.
It was sort of like a
chopped up Mr. Weatherby and murdered him.
And it also changed the word balloons and stuff.
Yeah.
He was kind of messing with the original comics. It's a little like détournement, which definitely was this situationist trick, but then also like this kind of under erasure, this surreptitory idea, which is what you're talking about, crossed out words.
He wanted to do a comic himself. He wanted it to look professional to a certain degree. He knew I'd be able to do that.
Yeah. You have the skills.
Yeah. Like, his drawing was a little bit kind of raw he's a very sharp learning curve artistically, so he's a bit raw. He had all these ideas, and then he's struggling to get his techniques up to the point in it. It's too bad because
you have to be slightly insane to do comics. You have to be OCD to do comics.
It's really
you have to lock yourself in a room and just.
Took me a long time to finish.
You don't have.
And you did the coloring for it, right?
Yeah.
That was like
that was accidental.
Came about really strangely because I was going to do it myself, but when something happened at the time, and then Marguerite did a thing, I was like, holy shit, that's completely different than anything I've ever seen in my life. So she really added a whole other thing, and then she really became like the third full collaborator. So now she's actually on the cover as the full third co-author of the book because what she did is so intense. Cool. And she also knew David in a different way and knew his palette in a sense and knew, added a different emotional value.
Yeah, it was definitely not colors you see, and also not the style that a colorist works in. Then, when colorists and inkers work together, it's all pretty blocked out. And you didn't, your colors bled, your colors.
Everywhere.
Yeah.
I was not about to just let
it's
it
also
be.
with his text, there's this, thing of like, it's not, he didn't give a rational sequence. It's like he goes, here's this stuff. Can you turn this into like basically making it into a movie? Like how do you make one scene go into the next? And so I sort of.
So he didn't really map it out. He just gave you a text.
Sort of the first part, like he's like, this is me as a kid in Times Square, and then this happens.
And
the guy giving me a blowjob, and I see this lady in it. So he had the rough structure of
He'd
that.
give you
but
drawings once in a while.
once in a very
Very
rare, but basically
busy.
gave me this stack of stuff. He's like, can you make this into a rational thing? So I had to really like edit the fuck out of it to make it work in that form.
But then James was actually the person that started cutting up the
We need
things and
this
taping it.
scroll, like a cut.
And then David liked that, and
Cut
then he
them
just
in.
kept doing it for everything.
These things and
Yeah.
little strips and
Yeah.
glued them together and like, okay, this is how it'll work as a sequence.
But I mean, it's like it was sort of also, it's William Burroughsy.
The cut up idea.
Yeah, and we
Thank
just
you.
were all, I mean, it sounds so stupid to say at this point, but it was a romance. We were living this romance at the same time as, we're trying to make these hard points about politics, but it was a very romantic world that we were living in. Where, who has the luxury of not really caring about what happens next week, or, I mean, we didn't really concern ourselves with how we were going to pay the rent or any, normal
By the
considerations.
time we were done with that book, though, you were like, I mean, we were really grieving,
Yeah.
basically, for David. So,
Right.
I mean, it sounds
Yeah.
corny to say, but when you were doing the watercolors for that, you were actually, the paint is...
Right, so the book,
tears,
yeah,
tears in the paint.
It's finished posthumously. I mean,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah,
like,
it's like we're just trying to deal with the feelings about him and trying to finish this fucking thing because we feel you should.
I spent a lot of time, like other people, that David took for breakfasts.
Yes.
So that was a thing. He'd take you out for breakfast, and you
he
sit
likes
and
to
have
eat.
He liked to have his breakfast and have long conversations, and and so we spent a lot of time talking about his life on the streets, and what that meant, and and I would ask him, like, I'm saying, of course you don't know what I was asking him. I was really disturbed by him having to make a transition from this terrible life he'd had into this now gallery world, and him feeling quite exploited in this. And I couldn't really see a division between the way he'd been exploited as a rent boy, and now he's making art and feeling exploited in that way as well. And I said to him, I asked him one day, I said, well, what did you do when you got money, David? How much did you get? Oh, $5. And what did you do with that? I feel like I'm going to cry. I got on the bus and I went to the country. And, so that's the other side of this urban person that David was, like, incredibly urban. And I think when we're looking at him with Louise, flying out to the country at the first opportunity, going out into the wilds, and that other side of
We're kind of traveling
David.
buddies, right?
Yeah, they did that, but then because I never quite understood the falling out they had.
They had a falling out.
Yeah, they had a pretty bad falling out. I remember when Luis died, David David spoke at the memorial, which was at St. Mark's Church, and David kind of just found like expressing how angry he was that because AIDS was taking people away from us like really quickly, that friendships were left unresolved, and basically saying, I was still pissed off at Luis and I hadn't really talked to him, and now he's fucking dead and we can't make up or something like
The
that.
last thing I saw of his was like a show of like these candles, almost.
Yeah, the last work of Luis
Where
was
was
so.
that? Was that at Al's gallery? Where was
No, I just think I saw. No, it was a gallery
on
at Avenue
Avenue
B or Avenue
that?
A, was it?
on Avenue A? Near where you used to.
Did anyone
Yeah.
remember this work? Walter, do you
I
remember this?
remember the candles.
He was really, he was really sick,
Beautiful.
Luis.
Yeah,
and he
they
was
were
just doing-
beautiful.
The candles just at the bottom.
Yeah, it was like it was
Sputtering out.
Oh.
definitely reeking of mortality in every way. But anyway, I did ask Luis, like, what happened? Why aren't you guys talking? And because we all have, everyone who was friends with David has a lot of sitting around a diner story with him, because David was perpetually ravenous, right? And ate probably 5 meals a day, I think. I mean, the guy had like a tapeworm, and he just had this crazy ass metabolism.
Just remembered
And he
another
was
time
always
you're
kind of
right.
hungry. Like if you ran into him, he was like, "Let's go eat." And what Luis told me was that, like, well, David wanted to like go for a walk in the jungle, and then like an hour into it, it's like, well, let's, or 2 hours into it, it's like, where's there to eat? And it's like, well, we're in the middle of the jungle.
Catch a
And
snake.
you know, doesn't want to say anything bad about anyone, and this is like such, you know, would never wear like we would wear our fights on our sleeves. You know, he would be like, well, you know, David can get a little upset when he gets hungry. it's like, and I can just see David in the jungle getting hangry and like sort of like Louis scared for his life. But it reminds me of like, you know, thinking of the meals. What else do I have?
No, you know, when we went to Virginia, we were so scared because, you know, it was like, it was, in my mind, it was the South, which I guess it is the South. And, you know, David was sort of...
Crackerland.
Yes, and so we looked a little bit, you know, different. And we're traveling with a gay man who was going to say something at any given moment. And
we were all
gay
frightened. To them?
Yeah, exactly.
Completely alien. And I remember packing to go on that trip. And all I had was an evening gown. And a turquoise tutu, really, like all nets. That was I had and a jumpsuit. That was all I had. I don't know what the hell I was thinking I was going to do, but I was just thinking, oh, this is.
Well, going to sleep was not one of them, as I remember.
No, we didn't go to sleep.
Well, they didn't give us any place to sleep. It's like, here's an empty room with nothing.
Yeah, no bedding.
Lay on the
bedding.
floor
Just
because
set
you're
us-
obviously beasts.
And Marilyn was smoking a lot, and so she got a room to herself, and it was the only room with carpet in it. Why she was smoking in the only carpet room is a mystery, but...
What the fuck is wrong with those people, man? They treated us like animals.
Well, we behaved like animals, didn't we?
We did! They got it
like
back!
animals
They
because
got
they
it
were
back!
treating us like
Yeah, that's
fucking
true.
It was great, though. It was a great trip. It was
And now
sparked
they
much
probably
creativity.
go, ooh, the wonderful show. Like, they probably build it up
I
as
think
their
they
legend.
did. I'm
Like,
sure they did.
we gave these artists an opportunity, the great David Wojnarowicz and, you know, Marilyn Minter Luchip and blah, blah,
Yeah.
blah.
And
Right?
David Weston is one.
But at the time, they were like, get the fuck out of our place, you heathens.
Yeah, that's true.
I
Y'all.
didn't notice any of that. I must have just floated through that.
Yeah, you were.
I had a
you were-
baby.
Yeah, you
It
were.
was, you know.
We were kind of oblivious.
You know, there was a real ethos for collaboration in that time. Not just specific to the East Village. I think downtown had a lot of that. And I'm reminded because I think it was like an ethos. It was a strategy. It was all these different things. It was different ways of you know, not just uniting, but also yeah, there was
Andy and Jean-Michel were doing this thing, and they got shit on for that, big time.
right. But John had already collaborated
Christophe
with Al
and
Diaz.
Yeah, he had his whole
Christophe
other
and
thing.
Marilyn. It just seemed to be a lot. And I remember Luis telling me this story about, like, I guess he knew John Cage a little bit through different circles. And John would do these, you know, events, these concerts, where everyone was kind of asked to do their own thing, right? So it would be a lot of chance, but if you kind of like, you know, Cage is also in his own way a control freak who embraces chance. So it's all, you know, it's got its own like unwritten rules. And Luis told me he brought like a huge tuba, and you know, which he didn't know how to play, but just wouldn't stop. Whatever horrible sounds he could make out of it, he never stopped until Cage lost his wits and threw Luis out of there, and that was the end of what had been a friendship. Did you ever hear a story like this one, Hal? No. But I just remember that I was going like, well, that's kind of interesting because there is a thing through the 20th century. It's always the most difficult work to sell. Obviously, the surrealists like collaborate, but artist collaborations are weird anachronisms that never actually attain the market value. They're like super groups that no one buys the records.
No, there is a problem. Like, for instance, Keith Haring was collaborating
With LA2, with Angel.
LA2, and the dealers would take LA2's name off them, because they were like, oh, the LA2 is lowering the value of this.
Right.
So, you know, it was like against the money-making ethos of the galleries.
But, you know, David did a collaboration with Kiki and Marionettes, which we had at the Acid Show, which was a really nice piece.
No, they did a whole show at Great House. It was
Yeah.
David and Marion and other people.
Well, I remember he worked with with Kiki on a few things. I don't remember them ever showing anything. I just
No.
thought that
Yeah,
stuff
yeah,
never
we had
saw
that
the
in
light
the
of
There
day.
was a show at Great House that was his collaboration, and definitely with Marion.
Okay.
I don't know. Yeah, he worked with Kiki. You know,
Yeah.
he
Well,
did the,
so, I
the
mean,
thing with
that's-
us was with Richard Kerman.
That's very
Right.
specific to David's.
David definitely had that. That was like really,
Wanted to do that.
yeah.
And he did
He and
beautiful
Kiki
paintings.
made big, full-size body prints with blood. You
That's, I remember that's what they did, but I never
Yeah.
thought I saw them except in
Uptown
Kiki's
somewhere,
studio. Maybe.
I was asking Hal about this one of the big posters that they did in Buenos Aires. David and Luis did together. It was a shanty town, and they painted it together. It was a really beautiful piece. I've never seen it
Wow.
in the books. It's fantastic.
Did that stay
We
down
have
there?
a slide of that because I got it from Phil's library.
Very good.
But you know, this goes to a certain type of safe, feeling safe. That
Uh-huh.
you know, when we went and did that thing in Virginia, and then we did something in Ground Zero on 10th Street, and then we did another one on 9th Street. That we had a group of people that we felt comfortable with, that we could trust, which is extraordinary. Because a lot of times, you know, other artists won't work with you, or they, you know, you have to have exactly the right people to feel comfortable enough to be able to collaborate, and to have a large group of people that you can collaborate with. Like Keiko joined us.
Keiko was
right.
Yeah, Keiko came in. Lovely. She was just great to work with.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it seemed to be more involved for David, the nature of collaboration. I can't, help but think it's almost like the criminal thing in him. And it was funny, I was thinking of this piece.
Would that
because-
make us a gang?
I think so, James.
Yeah, gang, yeah, exactly, art gangs.
I like
But
that.
when PPOW did that last show about David's installations, it reminded me that really when David walked away from participating in the art world for a couple of years, this would be a period where he starts making movies, he's getting involved in different things, but he was so...
He was showing with us.
Yeah, exactly, showing with you. He got really angry at the art world mistaking the art world for the art market, which is something we all hate. But the art world's much nicer.
Yeah, that's what I was
And the deal breaker for him was that biennial, and I think that's 84 as well, the Whitney biennial he was in.
85.
85, something like that, 85?
Yeah, it's in there.
It's so nice being in a room full of people with better memory. And
Yeah.
It was 85?
East Village, East
Yeah.
Village biennial.
Yeah, where there was like
We have to do
4
that.
artists from East Village in it. But right around that time, this guy who was on the board of the Whitney, and this is the whole machinations that made David so angry, so livid, was hired him to do an installation, a piece for a commission in his fancy uptown brownstone.
Oh.
And David really hated this people, and then they gave him the basement, which was like the kids' playroom or something like that.
Yeah, and you know who that is?
And then
It's
he,
the Mnuchins
that's
and
the
their
thing.
son.
That's the thing. It's like the
You know
evil
who their son
Mnuchin
is.
family. Yeah, exactly. The Steve
Calm
Mnuchin's
down.
dad. The guy's
Stay
got
calm,
that gallery.
Stay calm.
But so David, well, I didn't know. I mean, I was just like, I thought it was this typical Wojnarowicz class rage. It's like, oh, David, like, is there a rich person you do like? Of course you fuck it. And then, of course, it does turn out to be the biggest asshole in the end. But what he did, is like he basically got, I don't know if you helped him. I remember like Tommy Turner. I remember like real delinquents. His crew for that one was pretty delinquent.
We all carried turds.
And basically, like, go into the burnt out lots. If you find dead rats, make sure to grab those. I mean, just grab the nastiest garbage, the most infectious, horrible, rotting, stinky shit you can find, and let's haul into this guy's house. So a big, there was some beautiful elements to that installation, but it was really gnarly. So,
It's a well-seasoned installation.
yeah.
What's this thing with this like from 1983? You've got a collaboration between David, Luis, and Bidlow, 3-person collaboration.
Nice.
That's kind of interesting.
I just did a catalog essay for Mike, so I actually got to see him. He's a bit of a hermit. And he had a show, I guess it's probably open around, maybe already open, in Zurich. And it was not Liechtenstein's. It was really fun. It was so fun to hang with Mike and
Yeah.
get back into that weird mind of his, which I hadn't really visited in decades. And it was this, because, and he was they were the 3 who, started
That was
the pier. There was the 3 of them together.
Yeah.
And
I went to that. I just didn't.
postmodernism didn't really understand how different Mike was from the rest of the kind of critical stuff, because it's just really interesting the way he digs so deep, almost as this amateur scholar, but like really, anyway, it was cool.
No, and he told me, he said, well, I'm from Union stock. That's one of the first things out of his mouth.
From what?
Bidlow, telling me about union backgrounds. Started telling
What's
me
a
about
union?
family being in unions.
Oh, right. Okay, union worker.
Yes.
Interesting.
Yes, yes.
Yeah,
So
we like
that's,
the unions.
so that was his
I was
take on things, which was a bit of a surprise.
I was actually tripping down memory lane like 2 days ago. I was talking to this really interesting woman who's doing a show at the Guggenheim coming up called Defacement, which is based off of the famous Basquiat painting of Michael Stewart's Murder by the Police, which I guess is 82. I can't remember what year it was, 84, I think.
Yeah, David did a poster for that.
And that is David's poster, right?
Yeah.
I was sure of it.
I ID'd it for Seth Tabak when he put it in the show. He's like, well, how do you know? It's like, it's fucking
Oh,
obvious.
great. So I can tell her that because they're like, well, we showed it to Cindy Carr and she couldn't. And I'm like, well, Cindy knows more about Dave than the rest of us, but I would not ask her to authenticate work. She's not
That's
like an
not
art
what-
person.
Actually, I got it authenticated from somebody else that knew David at the time. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
definitely-
Well, Tessa said like, well, no, the reason why we had that poster is because David gave it to us, and David was not the kind of guy who go.
Well,
Anyway,
he put
so
his name on
all this to say, I don't know why I'm going off on this tangent, but so there was a big benefit with like 3 Teens Kill 4 and like this young singer named Madonna and
yeah.
Gene Caffeine or whatever, Danceteria. And then there was the poster for that big rally in Union Square. And both were organized by Howie Montag, who is sadly one of the most forgotten, most important people from that time. And you know, he organized all that stuff, and I was talking to her about it. She goes, well, you know, so I've reached out, I've been in touch with Howie Montag's sister, which is kind of interesting and stuff. She goes, and it turns out Howie was like, his dad was a labor leader, a union guy.
Oh,
So
I
like,
knew that
oh.
was going to come.
Yeah, you knew it was somewhere. Why is Carlo wandering so far afield? But I think we should open it up to some questions maybe, right? Is that, yeah, you guys know as much as we do. Or is that too?
Did Bidlow do something at the Times Square show where he jerked off every day of the year into little,
Was that the Times Square show?
I think that was the Times Square show, little test tubes or something.
What, just another guy jerking off on Times Square?
Well, the Times Square show had 3 themes, didn't it, Charlie?
I don't know.
Wasn't it or Walter, someone here? Wasn't the idea that it would be sex, drugs, and money?
They're happy just as long
Wasn't
as
that
you
the
keep-
general concept? Not that anyone followed the rules,
Kung
but
Fu.
Kung Fu, yeah.
Well, you know, the other place, just that anybody wants to think about, the other place was a connection for me with David, was Paris and France and all of that thing.
Right, that was all when he was younger, though, right? Did he go back much over the years? I think he just like went over there when he was young and kind of fell in
No,
love.
he ran
there.
into, of all
There.
things, he went there and ran into
Later.
Michael Carter, which is like
Later
extraordinary.
years, he went over there.
Yeah, he went over there then. But he was really interested in French literature going on.
Yeah,
And
I think we were all a little bit under the spell of that.
yeah, and I remember I sat and talked to him about Arabor, Wiesman's book, and there was one of the stories in there, it's like all these different chapters, different things are happening, and there's a funeral, black funeral for his virility, which David, of course, loved that story. But one of the things in there was, there's a whole section about orchids, all these different orchids that the man, he becomes a recluse, and he brings the world into himself instead of going out.
This is the Wiesman book.
Yeah, this is the Wiesman book. And there are all these orchids that are rotting, and they look like dead things on them, growing on them, and dead flesh and illnesses, and you know. And I think that had a lot to do with David's flowers later on. That he was thinking somewhere
last
about
series
that,
of
that
flowers.
last series of flowers, you know.
Mm.
So I think
Fleur de Mal.
yeah, so
Yeah.
but it's all pulled in from that decadence
I think,
thing.
but like, you know, because that was the decadent writers, but I think Baudelaire and Rimbaud are both like, you know,
Yeah,
central to that kind of
but
literary tradition.
but
right?
see, I've been thinking.
And of course, David did the Rimbaud in New York.
Yeah,
so.
I've been thinking through, there was this guy that wrote, which I know David read it, called L'Enfer Hell by Henri Barbusse, who was in the lineage
One of the decadents?
He's earlier.
19th century?
He's in Algeria, and he's another one that was looking at. His book Hell is a guy sitting in a room looking through a crack in the wall at other things happening in another room.
Jeez,
People
sounds
having sex, and and it's right in the. I was thinking how much David did that. Just thinking about the thing he'd built in our gallery.
Yeah.
But also all the time this idea of looking into things. It's there. It's in the work quite a lot. I hadn't really thought about it.
It is funny because we were,
Sorry,
we were all we all stayed very much in our neighborhood. But Charlie, you and Jane were in Times Square, which was a kind of parallel, like the Bizarro world or something.
We've both been going there for different reasons since '78. So long before the Times Square show.
Yeah.
We're both going up there.
Well, 2 years, which back then seemed like a long time.
A lifetime.
Now it's like an afternoon nap. But I think that as a kind of like sexual topography, it really interested him. Not just the fact that he may have turned tricks there, but it seems to me that it was really the primary place. I'd say clubs and definitely graffiti would be another one, where you had like interclass and interrace contact continuously, which actually didn't happen so much in New York's.
Segregated.
New York has a lot of internal segregations going on,
Very.
which I was not always aware of at the time.
Very much.
And that somehow because of the porn theaters, and especially ones where they allowed guys to blow other guys, you had this
I think that
incredibly fertile interclass.
it was a place where there was a lot of people that were semi-homeless, and of course David is another person that was semi-homeless for a long time, and going to 42nd Street was the thing to do if you were homeless, because it offered suggestions of how you might feed yourself.
For cheap, or you could spend the night in the movie theater.
Exactly.
Yeah, I
so
walked
it's a place where you could spend the night in a movie theater for 50 cents or $1, or cop some weed and then sell some weed. Just you'd figure out some way to survive there. People figured out ways to survive on 42nd Street.
And then there was that great bar that Maggie had, Tin Pan Alley, right? Which had, and I didn't go there all that much. Uli bartended there, and Nan and Kiki, I think, were there. Nan Gold and Kiki Smith.
I bartended in it was a restaurant called Bernard's. It was opposite the Melody, and most of our clients, well, there were a few rock and roll people, but most of the clients were mafia and prostitutes and strippers.
Where was the street?
Bernard's on 48th. So it was like the Melody was the strip place.
That's really
across the road.
close.
And yeah, so it was like, and they were right over the thing. So that was
That's on 42nd Street.
I was there in about 1980. But, and I got quite friendly with a lot of the guys. I mean, I got friendly with all of them because I was there. I was a young girl, And they took me all around. I mean, it was like the craziest thing. Yeah.
Mafia people.
They had all sorts of sex workers also.
Yes.
But did David? I didn't hang there that much because it seemed like I don't remember for all of David's kind of things in Times Square. I don't think he ever found it. Right? He didn't
I think he was like on the next block. Because where he would take James was like down on the next avenue, which had a lot of gay porn. As opposed to the straight porn. Right to James.
Turned you out, did he?
Never mind, James. But,
creating a new back.
But there were loads of drug dealers just a block down from Times Square. At the other end of the block, it was all drugs. It was like all young Puerto Rican guys dealing
9th
drugs.
Avenue.
Yeah.
Or 8th Avenue is what
yeah.
you're talking about.
Yeah.
If you go from Broadway to 8th Avenue, which is the next avenue over, there was a lot of gay.
Yeah.
Adonis and all those places.
I mean,
Yeah.
by the time he took me up there
Like-
to look at what was he wanted me to draw, it wasn't there anymore. Hubert's Museum and all that shit. I think it's in Hubert's Museum. I saw in the one with everybody's talking, that film. What the fuck is it? Midnight Cowboy.
Yeah.
You see, they go by that. It was gone, so you know.
Well, when I was colouring the
And
comic,
then,
I was drawing on that experience of being back there just as
And
an
then, of course,
aside.
before David and Richard collaborated on You Killed Me First, the installation for your gallery, David, I think, was in Richard's, I think it's kind of Richard's first movie, Richard
Yeah, that
Kurtzman's
one where-
movie, Manhattan Love Suicides,
Such a
and that's
great
all
bit.
shot in Times
There's
Square.
like Oprah Dooley's faces and his arm flies on.
Yeah.
That's just hilarious. It's still, that holds up pretty well.
It's pretty good. It's like,
Richard's
it's,
such a good cameraman.
Yeah.
It's still actually,
and there was a big spell, I think, you know, like Club 57 on, but like pre-video kind of, but like just this of the old auteur kind of B horror movies. So Herschel Gordon Lewis and people like that were kind of had a big influence on that time. I don't know if anyone remembers
I
that.
mean, Nick said.
Yeah, I don't talk about him.
man, fuck him.
I hope he's in jail. Good. Is there any questions we want to entertain? Sorry, go ahead.
In the sort of shooting the shit with David at the diner sense of the phrase, like he talks a lot about, like there's a tension between him and God in his work a lot, but is that coming up when you're sitting with him? Like, what's his spiritual path look like from the outside at the diner, if anything? Or is that just something that just sort of only existed in the work?
He's all like fucked up like Catholicism.
Yeah, I guess he was. I
He went
forgot
after
that
it
this-
a lot later
Yes.
on, you know.
Yes, but I mean, you know, the thing about being with David was there was an intention to do something important. So when you're sitting with him having a conversation, there was some import to what you were doing, which seems really strange to explain that. Did you get that sense from him? He wanted to do something important. He
There's
was
always a lot
never.
at stake.
Yeah, there was a lot at stake.
Yeah.
There was a lot at stake.
He had a global view, you know.
Yeah.
and that
Yeah,
kind of
so
was
you didn't sit down with David and talk about the, you know, like, oh, did
Yeah,
you
it
see
wasn't-
so and so? You went straight into, you know, which is why
Yeah.
when I talk about him, it sounds a little bit insane that I'm saying I told him about this book and I told him about that book and we talked about this book, because he would ask you questions and you were there to like, here's what I got, David. I got this for you, and I got this, and I got this. Can you use this? Oh, good. Okay, what else? What are you going to give me back? Okay, you're going to tell me this. Now we're going to move on to this. And it was definitely very inspirational and made you feel like you were doing something worthy, having a conversation. It was sort of the, you know, all of these thoughts that you'd been having, you were able to exchange, you were able to give to David, and he would give you something back. But the Catholic thing was a...
Yeah, I mean, I was an atheist, so I couldn't really understand people's, even if they had Catholic rage, but he did share like as much hatred for the church as I always did, and I that was the extent of it. I think a lot of it, you know, a lot of the other stuff in there, like it's his interest in other cultures. I don't think that was a spiritual quest. I could be wrong. I never felt that off of him, and I never really read it that way. If anything, you know, it's like it would belong in that tawdry history of primitivism that we have in our culture, and are slowly, hopefully, correcting our relationship to the other that way. But
it's not for nothing that these globes and maps and you've really seen the planet as an entity, as like a whole thing.
Yeah.
I mean,
That
that's...
we're all like break out of the borders, and there's not this artificial bullshit separating us.
But the one other thing about the restaurant, sorry to bring it down to something so trivial, but it always surprised me that, because I thought they were both equally great artists, but another artist who died too young from AIDS lived considerably longer than David, even though they were diagnosed around the same time, but he got the cocktail first, was Martin Wong. And David hated Martin Wong, like with a passion. Like, and it was just like, you know, I just couldn't even defend it anymore, because it was like visceral, his hatred for Martin. And he thought he was a bad artist, and he thought he was a shitty human being. And one of the closest I could get for an answer out of David out of it was that Martin was another guy who loved to eat. And also always went, and I think they always would see each other in restaurants, and Martin, ate like a pig. He would never stop talking, and so his mouth, in his mouth would be food, And I think it was
mustache.
I think it was restaurant hatred, because I can't really, it's like, but anyway.
This is completely new to me.
Yeah, no, I was always shocked. And it was like, wasn't, Dean Savard, who we mentioned earlier, he was always like, I can't believe you like those paintings, because Martin's first kind of work that he got to show in New York was he did a deal for this place, Dojo's, I think it was?
Yes.
Some restaurant, St. Mark's Place, that was there for decades and decades. And he traded them like 3 of little paintings of bricks, little brick wall paintings that they hung on a brick wall, and like a lot of people didn't even notice them. But Dean was like, I can't believe, you guys like that guy's work. But for whatever reason, like, there was some aspect of civilian warfare that was.
You curated that place, and I took it over from you. Dojo. We all had a tab at Dojo.
No, that wasn't Dojo's. That was Jaffa.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Yes, it's true. We used to work for food.
Barter is good.
Yeah.
It's not a
We
bad.
need to bring back
Showing
that
more
time.
psychedelic California style, burning globes and things like that.
Right, the stuff. You mean Martin stuff from the
Yeah,
'70s
yeah,
before he came to New York? That stuff's great.
At Dojo's. Or maybe that was an Eli Buck's Antiques.
I think that's right. I think Dojo's was just bricks, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, it was on Dojo. Yeah, we used to go to Dojo's.
I was very pissed off with David for dying. I'd just say that. So David was pissed off with people for, not letting them resolve things. And I had that same feeling about David. I was like...
Yeah, and it is shocking that Martin ends up, not shocking, it's like we understand medicine well enough, but Martin ends up living like another 6 years because he's originally from San Francisco. His mom's like on it right away.
He was older than the rest of us, really.
He was far older, yeah.
Yeah, he's considerably older.
Born in
But such a pedophile by nature, he was, kind of one of us. Martin gets the cocktail, the treatments, like almost immediately, and then so he lives so much longer. But him and David are kind of HIV around the same time, and I remember when David told me that he had AIDS, it was of course at a memorial service. It was for Seton Smith. And he goes like, I got to tell you, what? I'm sorry. So, horrible. One of the Smith girls. There's Kiki, Seton, and Bibi. And Bibi was actually Walter's wife at the time. So for Bibi's memorial, and David was, again, religious stuff. He was really angry because it was in a church or something like that, and these people don't care. But so he said he had something to take me. We went to a bar around the corner. That's when he told me, and you could still smoke in bars back then. This is an old story. So he's like drinking and smoking a cigarette, and like says to me really, very specifically, like, people would tell me that I've got to take care of my health now, and I'm like, fuck you, I'm like living my life my own way and going out of my own way, and I wasn't, did I manage to channel him?
Yes, channel.
Sorry.
Yeah, if he was still here, he'd be smoking like a motherfucker.
Well,
Maybe,
possibly.
maybe not.
Possibly,
Well,
maybe not.
Tom still smokes.
That's wild, because I didn't go to that first evening of the Whitney,
Yeah.
but I guess Tom was kind of bringing around an oxygen tank or something and smoking away. You got
It's like
that.
Spiegelman in that.
Yeah.
But David had 3 times, was tested 3 times before he finally got the.
Right, you got the letter in your bill.
Yeah, so he had 1 test where they said positive, then he went again and they said negative, and then the 3rd time positive, and that's when he said okay.
Yeah.
So that was 88.
Which was actually shocking.
88?
Yeah.
It was shocking that you could have multiple tests and get it wrong. But he sent me a news clipping of himself lying on the floor at some demo with a coffin, and David, and a little arrow pointing down to it, me. Like, oh my God.
Nothing like a little gallows humor
Yeah, like
there.
a little gallows humor. Me in the
Wow.
coffin.
Sorry, go ahead.
How did the locals receive your show? Did you stay long enough?
We didn't even stay for the opening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fighting, they didn't want.
Yeah, we really
No,
took the beer and ran,
There
I
was,
think.
I just remember, I actually remember saying to you, do you think it'll be all right for, because we were completely out of our minds, do you think it'll be all right for me to use pencil on this wall? And I was like literally carving pencil in, and you were like, oh yeah, that looks really good.
Oh, God.
You're like, oh, felt tip, sure, why not?
The felt tips.
Sorry, Hal, did you want to say something?
Just a point of information, you talked about Luis's candle painting.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He had done a proposal, which I presented to the clock tower, to do a clock of candle paintings. And so the first candle at 1 o'clock was the full length.
Yes.
And as they went around the circle, the candle burnt down to nothing.
That's what I remember, yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
Really
Well,
funny.
yeah, that wasn't at the clock tower though, it was on
No,
Howard Way.
it wasn't shown at the clock tower, but he wanted to show it at the clock tower. He wanted to do an installation of the 12 paintings in a circle, and they were not interested.
Didn't you briefly have a gallery on Avenue A?
I did, yeah.
You did?
Wasn't that show there?
Yes.
Oh,
Showed
okay.
them there. But they
That's
never
what I
were
remember.
shown at the clock tower.
They were particularly
bad.
fine.
That's what I remember.
They were really
Well,
fine.
Yeah, they're wonderful pictures.
Yeah.
Very
Yes.
good.
They're now dispersed among many different owners. But it's one of my dreams to reassemble them and show them. And we tried to do it for this show, but we we could only find about 4, I think.
So what year was that, Hal?
I think that would have been in around 87, 88, 80, end of the 80s.
It was, it had
And
to
that
be
was
like
really, that was the
86,
last body of work he
74.
created, right? Except for the drawings he did when he was bedridden.
Yeah, they were, and one of
He
those
left in 87.
little bedridden drawings is back here on the wall. The other thing you mentioned was Kiki Smith's sheet paintings, the body
Right.
prints. And she had done, at David's invitation, she had done one of those with him for his show here in '83. And we tried to borrow it for this show tonight, and, not tonight, but,
Right,
the
yeah.
show you're seeing. And Kiki said, well, Whitney wanted those also, but they were destroyed when Sandy hit my storage area and everything was flooded. And so she thinks they were just all thrown out.
Wow.
Yeah, very sorry.
Are you serious?
Well, I didn't even know about that. So she had some place out in Brooklyn or something?
No, I think in Chelsea.
Yeah, because all this stuff was flooded in
Yeah.
No. Yeah, I think we'll probably be finding out for years to come how much art was destroyed at that time. It
Well,
was,
people had basements.
yeah.
I will say one other thing David did was when they were shooting Where Evil Dwells, they had to bring Crosby, who was in a stroller, and him and Tommy, it was actually magnificent, the set, with Tessa
This is
was
a
there.
collaboration with.
You were hanging naked from a...
No, I wasn't. in that
No,
movie.
Tessa was bound up upside down.
Tessa
was
might have been
bound
naked in
upside-
that movie. I never was. In
She was
anyone's
bound up
movies.
like a mummy, upside
No.
down.
Someone else.
No, he wasn't.
Swear, I wasn't
You
in it.
weren't there.
Really?
I'd gladly, crow if I was, but I
But
wasn't.
they had survival research doing explosives all over the place. So the old train, right, was fantastic. It was really one of the best East Village things I've ever seen, although it was in Brooklyn, of course.
Yes.
It was incredible, the scale of it, hell. And then, so I had the baby in the stroller, and I'm supposed to go through these areas of hell, and they had explosives wired up. And David kept saying to me, it's fine. And of course, it wasn't fine. It wasn't a bit fine. These
Not for
explosions were
David's
going
sense,
up, and then Tommy Turner comes in like in some sort of caveman suit, and grabs Crosby from me, and there's explosions going off. So my reaction is actually not acting at that moment.
Yeah.
I'm actually completely freaking out, going, I'm going to kill you when we get,
And
a
your
quiet
son,
minute here.
and your son Crosby, I think, was in a Richard Kern
Yes, he was.
music video because Richard was it for Unsane or no? It was for Cop Shoot
Cop
Cop.
Shoot Cop.
That wasn't risky though, they just... Dude, it's
Yeah.
creepy.
But, you know, that's quite a
Well, actually, it
pedigree.
was fairly risky.
That's quite a
because
pedigree to be in, like,
Yeah.
David Wojnarowicz and Richard Kern films when you're
him
newborn.
and Talon Turner, and
That was
they were
Tommy.
two little tiny boys, and they were in a basement, and then Richard had somebody hanging upside down, and they were poking him with a stick, which is actually pretty creepy of itself. And somebody kept saying, if you leave him hanging upside down for too long, he's going to black out, and it could be, it could be serious. And then they're going, now Crosby, poke him with a stick. Make him swing.
Hanging upside down.
Yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't lovely. Richard.
It's surprising that people didn't call child services on any of us who
It
were
is,
having kids.
really. I actually didn't think anything wrong of it. That's about the side of it. I thought it was like, when we went off and all dropped acid, oh my God. We did have a bottle with us. I wasn't breastfeeding, just so everybody.
Your bottle of
I did it
vodka,
with-
you mean?
Well, I had that too. But, I thought, oh, these people are also nice and responsible, was my thinking.
Yeah, we weren't doing acid when
We
we were
just-
pregnant.
Not when I was pregnant. Oh, no. After I had the baby, I was,
The,
Yes, but I
by
had
the
to
way,
take
you know,
hiatus.
just I hate to have to always stick up for drugs, but the whole thing about acid damaging chromosomes was based off of one of those bogus, DEA, tests where the DEA funded anti-drug tests. What they did is they took a raw gene, just spliced it right onto a slide, and then dropped liquid LSD on it, and the whole thing broke apart. Well, it didn't occur to somebody until like 20 years later to go like, let's try to do this with like distilled water. And of course it's the same thing. It's like this idea that acid actually damaged chromosomes was one of the many lies they told us.
But you had a party somewhere, I don't remember. Where was the Demetria Daniels? They were tripping sitting next to Demetria Daniels for
Oh, that sounds like a
That
fun
was
trip.
ecstasy.
which was
That show we did.
you get, it was our
Acid
ecstasy
show
party.
brought you ecstasy, and that was the worst fucking drug ever. Because whoever you happen to be sitting next to is immediately your new best friend. So we're over here, and there's David, and he's sitting next to Demetria Daniels, who's this playwright lady. She's very kind of syrupy, sweet, but then they're like bonding and kind of melting into each other.
Wojnarowicz?
Yes.
Yeah, no choice. That's who was there.
No, you gave it to us.
Interesting.
which is-
Barry.
No,
I
because it
don't
was the
remember everyone I
ecstasy show.
gave drugs to.
No, because we did after the acid, which we did the acid show twice, I think, and then we did the ecstasy show. And you were like, oh, great, this is new, have this. And and then I was like talking to him as if I was like, oh.
I just saw the gossip column in East Philly about that show, and there's a whole thing about Steve Kaplan complaining that you wouldn't let him in. For drinking. All you had to do was let him in, give him some ecstasy, and put him next to somebody freaking weird.
Yeah,
And they would have melted together, and there'd been a new entity.
I literally don't remember one thing about this, but I won't
It's
deny.
fine, it's fine,
Sometimes,
But the idea of David
God's
Wojnarowicz
mercy.
melting into Demetria Daniels is interesting, and I don't know if it's an appropriate question, but it kind of, I'll just put it out there, and if it's wrong, we'll just change the subject. But David's been such a kind of iconic figure, not only for AIDS, but also for a lot of identity politics and stuff like that. And Whitney had a very specific story to tell, and I think they told it well, but it's not the whole story. I think we can say David was a very complicated guy, and his relationships were quite complex. And I wonder, in this history that's now been told, where is the place for the hetero men like James and me, or women? Because it doesn't seem to always congeal that way. Is this a weird question to ask?
That's a strange.
You don't feel like that, like something like David's show I met the David, the curator, the two Davids.
Well, I told Jim,
You
just
didn't
say
think
you're
that
bi.
was-
Just say you're bi from here on out. Because otherwise, it's
We're
just,
non-practicing
it's a little bit
Well, I mean-
we're non-practicing anything really.
Yeah, no, but
That show was a bit cleaned up in the terms of like, if you're just looking at David as this kind of easel painter, which they're trying to make him look like, it weakens him a lot because you're losing all the humor, you're losing all the punk energy of it, the craziness, the seasoning, all that crazy shit from the street is
It was a
gone.
good show
So
though,
this is-
James. It was good.
It's a
It was
neat
good.
show.
It's a good show.
They did an okay job
Yeah, it was a
of
good
that,
show. It
but-
was a good show.
But
Yeah,
it didn't
was
have the
good.
chaotic freak, and that's what's missing, and that's what is a little.
So I
bit-
think you're right. I mean, that's a really difficult question that we you know.
It's a hard one because
Yeah,
there is a narrative developing, and it's sort of like David was always like uber queer and all this
No,
stuff.
I
And it's
didn't
like,
get
sort of like David.
My gaydar didn't go off at all when I first met him. I didn't see him as being. He
Well-
was like this Robert Mitchum guy with a real deep voice.
I didn't
really
really-
read him.
I don't really talk about this, but one morning, I don't know, went out to have coffee with him. I've pretty much been up all night, and I wound up making out with him on the corner of Avenue.
I came home and she was smooching it up with David in front of the gallon. Chicks
Which
up, David.
I don't
What did
really
you do?
talk about that because it seems
The
like, you know,
page
so
matter.
irreverent at this point. But, you know, it was like,
A lot of
good
women had the
times.
Oscar David.
David and Kiki had this kind of romance.
Yeah, that was a romance as well.
you know.
Yeah, so it's a weird thing to negotiate. But I don't know how we would even tell the story differently than it's being told. But
But
I do think it's odd.
bisexuality didn't have that kind of tinge, like of unbelievability in those days. It's like we were all a little bit fluid.
Yeah, kids generally are.
Now they say you're either gay or you're not. It's like, well, wait a minute.
No, now we're coming back the
No,
other
actually,
way.
they don't
You
do
said
that.
No, now we've gone the other way, James.
No.
No, there was a
Yeah.
minute it got clamped.
No, we were actually
Back
way
the other
more
way.
binary than the way kids think now.
Yeah, yeah.
Anyone else some questions, or can we wrap it up? Sorry, there is a time for one more question. I didn't mean to be like, are we done yet? No, anyone else?
Well, thanks for suggesting, you know, that we need to shut up. I'll take it. Shut up.
We good? All right. Well, we'll hang out for a minute anyway if we want to continue. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, guys.
You know, I did bring some 7 miles a second if anybody wants that.
Oh my God.
There we go. Bring the merch.
I got that mark.
It's a great comic if anyone hasn't read it.